Hello, thank you for joining the ERJ Podcast. My name is Dr. Don Sin. I'm the Deputy Chief Editor of the ERJ. Today, I'm joined by Professor Melanie Kuninghoff to discuss her paper entitled The Hallmarks of the Aging Lung 10 Years Later. Dr. Kuninghoff is a professor of medicine in the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine and the director for the Center of Lung Aging and Regeneration at University of Pittsburgh, United States. Melanie, many thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, John, for having me. I'm really excited to be on this podcast.
Briefly, can you describe the hallmarks of aging relevant for the pulmonary community?
Yeah, so I think that's actually one of the biggest findings that we had when we did this new review, which is 10 years after we did the first one in 2015. And we really found that, basically by now, nearly every hallmark has been described for all of the diseases. And that is a change. And that is probably just showing you how much intense research actually went into that area. And it's also not really a big surprise, if you so want, because aging is still the biggest single risk factor for many of our chronic lung diseases, such as COPD and pulmonary fibrosis, for example.
And what are the processes of aging that are most relevant for COPD?
In COPD, I think really been more research actually over the past couple of years. And one of the findings that we can show, like from our review of the literature, is that, for example, inflammation, which we know is a very important component of COPD, but has really been, I would say, come even more out of our studies and of our research that we did. And you can see that, inflammation as a general concept of low-grade inflammation is something that has been there in the community, but specifically in COPD, where we anyhow have a huge inflammatory component. This is basically, putting the fire not out, but even more on the fire in terms of the disease processes. Also, some other aspects are loss of proteostasis. I think that's something that also really has come out, that, the regulation of how we deal with our proteins in our cells, how we degrade them, how we produce them. It's something that is heavily dysregulated. And this is known in aging and is really prominent in COPD. And then the last aspect, I would say, is specifically cellular senescence, which is one of the best studied hallmarks of aging by now, specifically in the combination of having senescence in stem cells, which leads to stem cell exhaustion. And I think this is really important to consider in COPD because we now know more and more about, next to inflammation, also the structural cells, specifically stem cells, are aberrant in COPD and cannot really do their job anymore. And this is something that we call an aging stem cell exhaustion, and that is something that has been more and more observed in COPD and is most likely driven by senescence, but probably also other processes.
And in the same way, can you describe the most relevant aging processes related to idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis?
Yeah, so in IPF or pulmonary fibrosis in general, I would say, there are some that are very specific also, I feel. For example, telomere attrition, which is, something that is a very well-described hallmark of aging, is, I think, best described also in pulmonary fibrosis. We really know that, for example, there's a genetic component to some of the pulmonary fibrosis cases, that many of the telomere-related genes, there is genetic variance so that we don't really have proper telomere function. And then also we have really telomere attrition. And, for example, in leukocytes in the blood, telomere length correlates strongly with survival in pulmonary fibrosis. So that really is a hallmark where I would say, we really do have strong evidence in a specific disease in the lung that is coming out of the hallmarks of aging. In addition to that, also cellular senescence, I mentioned this again because it is obviously one of the best studied also because we do have the right tools to look for senescence, but it has really come out actually also in fibrosis to be one of the driving hallmarks. And in the field of fibrosis, it actually went so far that we now do have clinical trials where we target senescence for the first time. They're all early on. We'll have to wait and see what comes out of them, but it's definitely a hallmark that is very present also in pulmonary fibrosis. And then the last one that I want to highlight is the extracellular matrix alterations. And this is something that I want to mention, because it's actually a hallmark that we have proposed 10 years ago, because within all lung diseases, extracellular matrix changes are very common. But specifically now the research also has increased. And this is something that in fibrosis we know very well that we have remodeling. We also have it in other diseases, but it's specifically prominent in IPF that we have dysregulation of this ECM and that this ECM is also disease driving.
Okay, let's go back to COPD. Are any of the hallmarks of aging treatable targets or therapeutic targets that people are working on that is close to the clinic?
Yeah. So I think there's two approaches actually on how we look at this, right? So there's ways, I think, where we have something in COPD where we can look at actually classical anti-aging drugs that are very, very prominent right now. A lot of them are in the news. For example, metformin is one of them that is known to be an anti-aging drug, and it targets a lot of different hallmarks, basically. Right, and that is something that is also has been looked into in COPD in the context, because there it could also specifically on the inflammation side of things could be a very relevant drug to target in the future. So I think that's one approach in general that people take right now. Like, are there these like overarching anti-aging drugs? On the other hand, and I think that's something that comes out in COPD, but also in other diseases more and more, is we have to understand these hallmarks like cellular senescence and what they really do. And I think we just don't know enough right now. And one of the things that people have started to look at, which is really exciting, is to see how do these hallmarks are interacted with each other. Is there a hierarchy? For example, how does senescence in COPD look different than senescence in IPF? How does it look different in COPD if we have it driven by mitochondrial dysfunction? I think this is where people are going after right now, like to try to understand this. And that will be future targets in COPD that I think are specifically relevant, again, like because they target stem cell exhaustion and really could help us to think about new ways of how we can repair, regenerate the lung, because we can get these stem cells more functional.
And you mentioned that inflammaging is one of the important hallmarks of COPD and other pulmonary conditions.
Mhm.
There are a lot of now anti-inflammatories either in the market or in development.
Yeah.
Do any of these, quote unquote, reverse aging?
Inflammation, what we have learned in the past, and the same I think holds true for inflammaging. It's a very broad term, right? And we have been somewhat successful, obviously, in COPD, like treating inflammation, but we also know that this is not enough. This is not enough to just help us in like cooling down the inflammation. We also have to understand how these inflammatory cells then talk to the structural cells, right? And where is the specific mechanism there so that we can then target this. I don't say that, it's not that we don't want to have anti-inflammatory drugs for COPD. We have them already. And now it's on us to fine tune them and make them more specific so that it's really something that also really targets the aging related mechanisms that this inflammation is driving.
And in terms of pulmonary fibrosis, are there any therapeutic agents or therapeutic targets on the horizon to reverse some of the aging processes related to pulmonary fibrosis?
In fibrosis, we do have, next to senolytics, we have other drugs also that are in development or in clinical trials right now. Most of them target either, again, like as I mentioned, cellular senescence or also mitochondrial dysfunction, which is another, a big hallmark that we, I think, have really learned a lot about over the last 10 years. And there are some of these that we can really, move forward. And I think that most of them are really close to at least entering clinical trial stage. And that's what I'm also excited about. Let's see what comes out in the future with how we can target these.
And you mentioned that stem cell exhaustion might be an important component, maybe a very important component or driver of cellular aging in both COPD and pulmonary fibrosis.
Mm-hmm.
What is the state of affairs in terms of stem cell repopulation or transplantation in COPD or IPF or any other pulmonary condition?
Yeah, I think in that aspect, this field really has shifted a little bit. Yes, there is, of course, always has been ideas about stem cell therapy. Most of the studies right now have not been, or preclinical studies have not been really made it into the clinic. And this is also because there's a lot of regulatory, legal aspect that needs to be considered. And also because these cells are not necessarily super well characterized. I think what we're trying to get to is to understand in our preclinical models, how does this work with with stem cell therapy? And then what can we learn to make that happen and to put it into something which is less risky into clinical trials for patients. The other aspect really is, I feel like, is that we really have shifted to looking really indeed more to the endogenous stem cells. And that's what you mentioned, right? Like stem cell exhaustion, if we could somewhat help provide that stem cell that is already there, but which is not functional anymore, with the right environment, the right cues to do a better job, basically. I think then that's another way of how we really right now, I think the field has changed in terms of, yes, there is stem cell therapy, we have tried it, and we really need to learn a little bit more on how we get to this further. But there is maybe that aspect of really going to the endogenous stem cells that we all have in us and try to rework them and help them do a better job.
And you mentioned that this is a review that follows up on a previous review 10 years ago. What are the key lessons learned over the last 10 years that you want to highlight for our audience?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons is that this is such an important field. There is much, much more research has been done, and we already have expanded our horizon in terms of what we know about aging so much more. But it's also very complex. And I think that's also something that we need to understand. I feel like we now have a really good playbook in front of us because we have gained so much more knowledge. The next steps, and that's the next lesson, if you so want, is like, how can we turn this down to very specific ways of how we go for disease-specific therapies? Or how can we also go to disease prevention? Because the whole aging field opened up not only accelerated aging, right? Like, what do we do when the aging is accelerated in disease, and how do we then treat our diseases? It also brought up healthy aging. And, over the last 10 years, this is something where we steady but slowly, right, learn more and more about what healthy lung aging really means. And if we understand that better, then we are much closer to thinking about prevention, to lung health, basically. And that's something is a lesson I felt, but also something that, is exciting in the field to see, because that really brings us to a different way of thinking about aging, and not only as the bad guy, if you so want.
If you had a crystal ball and you were to write another review for us, and I hope you will in 10 years' time, do you think we'll have age-related therapeutics? And if so, which areas do you think are poised for quote-unquote breakthroughs?
Oh, yeah, I hope this will age well. So, yes, I do. I honestly do. I think there's such a strong effort in the field to go to that. And again, I hope this review would have like another table where we really do have more clinical trials, where we maybe have preventive approaches, and where we do have hopefully some of the areas where we already are in clinic. I do think right now senescence, and not senolytics necessarily, because that's a whole different postcard that we can have about like if it's senolytics or how do we target senescence. But I do believe that the research in senescence will help with that. And the reason is that I feel like we do know most about the specific hallmarks, but also it's often one of the key ones that at the end is there, right? Like mitochondrial dysfunction leading to senescence, telomere attrition leading to senescence, and then senescence contributing to more inflammation. If we now starting to really put hierarchies and dependencies in these, I think senescence is somewhere in the middle, and that's where we can target a lot of diseases. And again, like where I think most of the research right now is, so that I would feel most comfortable in saying in 10 years, there is something where we can have a breakthrough also.
Very good. Any last remarks for our audience that you think they should know about?
Yeah, I think I mentioned most of what I feel is really important in this. I do believe the key is to connect these other different hallmarks, right? And make it more specific to the diseases that we are looking at. I think for a research audience, I would say like, hey, we need to better understand how these all work together. And, the ones that I haven't mentioned today, I'm sure there's a role, because I said at the beginning, right? Like there is, for all hallmarks already, there's a little bit of evidence. We just have to strengthen that. And I think for a broader audience, for clinicians, for maybe even the public who listens, is using the knowledge that we gain for therapies for sure, but also really thinking about how can we prevent and how can we foster lung health. I think that's really something that I feel is important, and that we can also take home, from the current research that is done in this field.
Thank you so much for a very detailed and thorough breakdown of the aging process related to pulmonary conditions. With that, we'll end our podcast. I want to thank Dr. Kuninghoff for her very enlightened discussion, and her full paper is now available on the ERJ website.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.